Okay, hello everyone. So welcome today to the Camp IFH and MERP seminar. It will also be a preparation seminar for the upcoming ERSCA conference in April. Today we have Dr. Trzesnewski here to give us a presentation on how to give an effective presentation. Dr. Trzesnewski was originally a student here at UC Davis. She received her bachelor's in human development here, along with her master's and PhD in psychology as well. And Dr. Trzesnewski is a recurring speaker here with Camp and MERPS, and we're very excited to have her back. And with that, I would like to have Dr. Trzesnewski have her intro.
Hi, thank you for having me back. I'm excited to be here and talk to everyone about giving presentations. Before I get started, I would like to just kind of open up to some discussion just so I can learn more about what you're preparing for and what you're thinking about with your presentations. So could someone tell me a bit about what are some of the presentations that you're preparing for right now? Do you have like conferences coming up? What is the one in April? Are there other ones? The Undergraduate Research Conference. Okay, great. I'm familiar with that one. Are there other presentations that you're preparing for? Ooh, next week, biophysiology, ERC, 29th, Stanford's Undergrad Research Conference. Okay, it's exciting. So as you're thinking about these presentations, what are your thoughts, right? I assume that there's, excitement. Is there also nervousness? Like what kind of thoughts do you have about it? What makes you nervous? Okay, so anxiety around answering questions, feeling like I don't know what I'm talking about, having someone ask a question I may not be familiar with. Okay, so this is very common for people to get nervous about, and my grad students get nervous about the exact same things. They think that I'm kind of crazy when I say like the question part is actually my favorite. That's because I feel like I'm at least not boring somebody because they're actually asking me a question, meaning that they're interested in something that I talked about, but that doesn't mean that it's not nerve-wracking. So I want to think about if you went to a presentation by that, like some high schoolers were given, right? So you were asked to come and listen to presentations and engage with the students. So what would you expect them to be able to answer every question that was asked to them? Does that seem, is that what you consider being fully prepared? Is that they would know every answer? Okay. So that you would expect that to be every answer. Okay. So when you're thinking about every answer, is it questions that you as an undergrad would be able to answer, or do you think about you would ask questions that you would think a high school student would be able to answer? I'm going to assume that at least some of you are thinking well, maybe I would adjust my questions for the high schooler to answer that. I also think about when you've watched talks being given, have you ever seen somebody not know the answer to a question? And what is it that you think about that person when that happens? Do you think oh my gosh, why were they invited to give this talk? Clearly they have no idea what they're talking about. They really must be kind of dumb. Yeah, right. So you think that it's normal for someone not to know the answer and they acknowledge it. So, right, I think that's really important, is that oftentimes it's not having some exact answer, it's kind of how you deal with answering the questions. Are you thoughtful about it? Do you reflect on it? Do you show engagement that you would like to go learn more about it? Like, that seems to stand out for people more than having the exact answer to a question. And I really very rarely, if ever, had someone say like, wow, that person really is just dumb and doesn't belong there. We tend to be a lot more forgiving of other people than we are of ourselves. And we tend to think that when we're talking to people, like if you're a student and you're presenting to professors, that we don't think of them as calibrating for how much they would expect us to know, which is what we would do, like listening to somebody else, right? So thinking about, that person isn't often, so often people aren't there sitting there being like, I'm here to criticize this person and find everything they do wrong, and I'm going to catch them in some mistake. This brings me joy to life. I am sure there could be people out there like that, especially in academics. You're working with people who've chosen to be here. They've chosen to be teachers. They've chosen to be lifelong learners. They've chosen to be curious about things. And that's what they're here listening to a presentation for. A lot of times they're there because they want to mentor and support students. And their expectations, they've worked with students for a long time. Their expectations are calibrated to what is reasonable. And they're not expecting you to sound like a colleague of theirs. So while it is kind of this very nerve-wracking and it feels very put on the spot, it's really, that thinking about how you would evaluate somebody else, thinking about like why the people are there, can sometimes help in alleviating some of that, or having realistic expectations for yourself. Right. Yes. Being basically, so there's like appreciating when people can admit what they don't know. That is like, it feels really good. Like when people are trying to force an answer and kind of pretend that they know more than they know, it tends to be more annoying than somebody who wants to learn. Are there any other things that people are thinking about that makes them nervous about the presentations? Okay, I will. So I'll go into some of my tips of presentations that I give out talking to a big audience. Yes. That's something that, unfortunately, like the easiest thing is just for practice. And so it's just being nervous right away. I think one of the things is that sometimes, like, I will often think like, oh, I'm totally fine. I'm ready to talk, and I'm completely prepared. I don't even think I'm nervous. And then I stand up there and my heart's racing. I can like hear it in my voice. And I was like, what happened? I was fine a moment ago before I stood up here. And now I'm really nervous. And like a big room definitely contributes to that a lot. And I don't have any magic tricks to make that not be nerve-wracking, but I think sometimes just realizing, like acknowledging that people are nervous, thinking again about you've been in the audience when other people have been nervous. And, again, it's like, that's what happens. It's a normal thing. And part of it is like our body's stress response is to pump more oxygen to our brain so that we, can think better. And that ends up with this faster heart rate but we are kind of trained to not like that experience and think of it as bad, as opposed to like, this is preparing us to do a good job. So then when we feel that, then it makes you more nervous. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous. And, you know, really just practicing every opportunity that you can. If you can get friends to listen to you give a presentation, if you're in a lab asking to be able to give a presentation there, just the more practice you have, the easier it becomes. And that's the same thing with the questions. To the more you talk to people about it, even just having casual conversations about what you're going to present, even if you're not presenting it, the more that you hear how people are thinking about it and the more comfortable you get with it. Not being sure what the audience is looking for. So it's interesting because, you know, the audience isn't always looking for something. I guess there's that question kind of has a broad thing. You know, if you are asked to give a presentation that's very specific, there might be something of what the audience is looking for. But in general, we tend to give very broad talks like today, how do you have a presentation? Well, I have no idea what you guys are looking for, right? I have like my concept of what I think might be useful. And because I've given this talk before and gotten feedback, it seems like, you know, that in the past people have thought it is useful. I have no idea whether you guys will think that it's useful. And so you know, to me, what works the best is talking about something that you're excited about and that you're comfortable talking about. And that's what makes a presentation more engaging, is someone being really excited about it and wanting to talk about it. And so even if it's not quite what I expected, I still enjoy presentations when people are feeling like that. But it's also okay, you know, as you go through your career, there might have different times that people are asking for you to give a presentation. Something that we don't always feel comfortable doing, but that we should do is asking those questions. So who's going to be there? What kind of background do they have? What expectations might they have for it? And just, you know, getting as much information as we can. Not being able to explain things clear enough. And so that again is the practice, and, you know, thinking about, you know, what most of the time you want to be able to explain things to a very broad audience. So sometimes we give presentations to a very specific audience that knows, you know, if you're in like a lab and you're giving a presentation to a lab, then they're going to want to know a lot of details. But a lot of times the talks that we're giving are for people across very broad backgrounds. So being able to practice with family and friends is the best way to work on that language, because if you can get them to understand it without having a background in what you're doing, then you're explaining things clear enough. I think one of my concerns is how to establish language for my presentation and make it understandable for lay people. Okay, so that was a similar question to just what I was just answering. So yes, so I would say practice talking to whoever you can get to listen to you. If you have friends in this group, right, being like, oh, I'll listen to your presentation if you listen to mine, you know, that's a great way to be able to not feel like you're burdening people. But yeah, the more that you can talk about it, the easier that it becomes, the more you can just refine your language and understand what is confusing and what isn't. I find that also when I just practice presentations to myself, I find places where I'm stumbling. So like as I go from this slide to that slide, I always seem to trip over it. I can't seem to remember what I was going to say very well. That to me is an indicator that I haven't figured out the language right, that isn't what how I should be saying it, or I'm missing some piece that I need to say before that. And so also just going through it over and over again helps me figure out the pieces that I'm more uncomfortable with or that aren't working. Yeah, how to make something very technical into jargon free. Okay, so I think about what it is that I want somebody to kind of leave. If I think about somebody else telling a third person what my talk was about. What is it that I want them to understand? What do I think could be kind of my take-home message that they're like, oh, that was really interesting. They said they talked about X or they learned X. And then figuring out what they need to know to be able to get to that level. I'll go through this more in the presentation, but generally, with the jargon, I would say sometimes, maybe often, is that we're trying to explain at a level of detail that's not needed. So for me, for example, I do research on self-esteem, and I've done research trying to find out whether kids younger than 8 can communicate their self-esteem. And so when I in a talk like that, that's what I would hope people could walk away from, is like, hey, kids younger than 8 were able to answer self-esteem questions, and it made sense in the way that they were doing it. Now I could get into the technicalities of why that might or might not be the case, and about the validity of the measures, but the reality is that someone can take that take-home message of what was interesting about it without understanding those technicalities. So often I find that you might be able to skip over it when you're doing a presentation. And maybe that's different if you're giving an hour-long presentation or you're giving it to, a specialized group. But often we're giving 10 or 15-minute presentations to a general audience. And when we're trying really hard to make jargon work, I always take a step back and say, do they even need to understand this at all? Can I just skip this completely? And it's hard to decide to skip it, because when you're deep into it, you think it's really super important. But when you take a step back, you realize that it really isn't. The other thing about the jargon is that often we think that's how we can prove to people that we know what we're talking about. And again, if you think about it as you experience listening to presentations at different times, it's not usually the jargon that makes you convinced that someone knows what they're talking about. It's usually really the clarity in which they're presenting that makes it a much more understandable and makes them sound very confident about it. So yeah, so the bottom line of that very long answer is that if you're struggling with jargon, maybe you don't need it, and I challenge you to try to do it without the jargon. Okay, let's say we have a mixed audience of experts and general ones. How do you approach that? So I approach that by speaking to the general ones. So I think that, I think about how if someone gives a catchy, lots of infographics and just a clear presentation, even if I'm an expert, I still enjoy that. And I find, again, so I think about, in my field, there's a lot of complex statistics that can be done with data. And so people will often want to put up these statistical models with all of the equations and everything up there, so that people can see, I did this the right way. And what I've learned is that it's very easy to throw in a line here or there, so for people to understand that without it even being on the screen. So I can say, to my hypothesis is, to understand, how well this measure of self-esteem is working. And so, I did a multi-level confirmatory factor analysis, and then here's what I found. And so I didn't write that multi-level confirmatory factor analysis on the slide. I didn't write equations. I didn't, show pictures of it. I just said it as I was changing slides. And what that does is it tells the people who would care about that, who know how it should be tested and care about it. It communicates to them, I knew what I was doing. I did this the way that you would expect. But at the same time, it doesn't bore anyone else. right? If I'm not interested in the models, when people flash it on there, you just like lose the engagement of that person. And the truth is, you're not going to teach them a structural model in, a minute in the middle of your presentation. So the people who understand it don't need those level of details, and the people who don't understand it won't understand it because you put it on the screen. Okay, so I will switch to my presentation. I'm happy for more questions. And let's see, so we'll go with this. Okay. And I've actually been out of the office for 3 weeks, and this is my first day back. And so as I'm talking about practicing and everything, I've given the presentation before. I have not reviewed it really before this. And for that, I apologize in advance. The timing just didn't end up great. So bear with me if I stumble over things. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is some tips for giving a presentation. It's not going to follow kind of how I would teach someone to do like a story arc of a presentation, because we're focused more right now on on just what some tips are, which isn't really the same as giving like a full research presentation. So my goal today is to convince you of that you should care about these presentation tips, to motivate you to want to learn more, and to give you resources to learn more. This is usually what really our goals. This to me is as much as we can usually accomplish in a presentation. It's very unlikely that I'm really going to teach anyone something very new to them. I really can more like whet their appetite and give just some hints of something that's exciting. Okay. And the hardest lesson that I feel like part of giving the presentation is that you can't teach everything, and you can't tell them everything that you want to tell them. So it's really about finding your main take-home point and focusing on that. So saying less is really hard. And I spend a lot of time with my students talking about cutting. Okay, this is a great start. Now you need to cut half of what you just put together. And that's for posters and for talks. Okay, so there's saying less, meaning that you really just have your main points, you focus on those, you make sure that everything you're saying is building towards those main points. There's also keeping it simple, which came up a little bit about the jargon. So I talk about like, don't utilize big words when simple words would suffice, or don't use big words when simple words will work. So I often see both in writing and presentations, this idea that it's like, things just as simple as utilize versus use, that we often want to use words that just sound better. But they're much harder, particularly in a presentation, and they're harder to read, where you're thinking about somebody sitting in a room, sitting online, taking in a lot of information. Rarely we're just one talk in somebody's day. And so we're in information overload all the time. So when we can give very simple messages said in simple ways, then we're more likely to keep people engaged. Okay, and then there's the overall story. So what you're, instead of thinking about just here are, these facts that I need to tell somebody, thinking about a story, like, what is it? Why is this interesting? And building it up. Like, this is something, like, why did you even do the study in the first place? What engaged you with it? Trying to reach back into your memory to when you first started and you were engaged and excited, communicating that. So write it kind of as a story you would tell a roommate or think, and then add the technical information as needed. So I had a student who, this was in writing, but would write so technically that even in the results section, I made him rewrite it with no statistics in there because I just could, even knowing what he did, I couldn't follow it. So it's amazing how you can still write even a results section without any statistics in there because you're still telling a story. You're talking about what was found and why that's interesting. And then the one take-home point. So I've gone back and forth on this a lot of how many take-home points you can have in a talk or in a poster. And sometimes, you know, if they're very closely related, maybe you could have 2 or maybe you'd have 3, but in reality, it's one take-home point. What is the point of this? What is the most interesting thing? And write for that. And then maybe once you're done with that, you'll find like, oh, I could put in a little bit more, like it's short, I could say more about it, but really focusing at least, you know, in the beginning to say, here's what I want people to leave with. They're not going to remember most of what I said. So what is it that I can get them to leave understanding and thinking is interesting? So for me, my one take-home point is don't overwhelm the audience. So it's better to say less than it is to say more. And my second point would be that there are great resources to help you to create these presentations, and I'm going to provide those for you. So I hope that what you remember is that, you know, oh, I listened to this talk the other day and the person just kept saying, oh, you just need one take-home point, just be really simple with it. And they left me with some resources. So, and that's why it's recorded and you can have access to the slides so that you can review all those resources. You don't need to be like memorizing everything and understanding every point that's made. Okay, so I'm going to take you through my process of how I put together a presentation. And it might be a little bit different than what you're expecting or what you've done in the past, and probably than a lot of my colleagues even do, but it works for me, which is that I start by picking a template. So it really helps me to start with the design of what I'm doing. And so I love SlidesGo, and I'm sure there's many other resources now of different slides that are put together, but it really helps me to kind of just start picturing what my presentation is going to look like. It also helps me to not put too much on a slide, because once I download a presentation that has graphics in it, then it constrains where I can put words and where I can put figures. And that helps me make sure that I'm not putting too much on that slide. Now, what I do find is that for SlidesGo, at least, that the font size is way too small. And so I first have to go through and make sure that the font is bigger everywhere, so I can put even less on the slides than I expect. But you don't want to put up things that people can't see. It's just frustrating as an audience member to be like, oh my gosh, there's so much on that slide and I have no idea what it says. And am I supposed to be paying attention to that or listening to the person? I can't do both of those things at the same time. And now I've just lost most of whatever the point was of this slide. So there's different, you can find guides online and stuff. Here I say like at least 20, maybe 24. I give some examples of what the different font sizes, but also the font sizes vary. So, you know, this particular font size, these are what the sizes are. If you change what kind of font it is, then an 18 might look smaller or larger than this. But just making sure that, you know, the idea is supposed to be that someone at the back of a large room could still see it. And then also it just helps to not overwhelm them with too much stuff on the slide. And so then, as I was saying, then I am forced to write within the constraints of whatever the designs are of the presentation template and making the text bigger so that it's readable. And this helps me to organize my thoughts. So often I have a blank slide in which I'm just typing out notes of things that I want to make sure that I say. And then I go and try to put like each bullet point on a slide. And usually I just can't fit very much. And that's really helpful for me to simplify my story. And I find out that I'll end up deleting like half the bullet points because I'll try to put them on slides. And then it's like, well, now I've tried to put too much on the slide. It's not worth it to cut it and put it onto a next slide. Like it feels like the point's too long, and so maybe I don't need it there. And then we're back to pick the take-home point. What is it that you want people to remember? So this again is my take-home point, you know, that you can give one clear message. So what is that? What do you want people to remember when they walk out that door? So then I start writing it out. As I said, like sometimes I'll have that blank slide where I'm just typing out all the notes. And then I'm cutting a ton. And every time I try to fit it on the slide, when it's not working, then I really sit back and look critically at what I'm writing and say, like, if I'm having trouble communicating this, then maybe it's not needed. And I really make, you know, force myself to it's basically like, you know, I have to convince myself that it's worth it, that there's a reason why I need this in here. They're not going to understand the next point. They're not going to understand the main take home point if I leave this out. And what I try to do is one idea per slide. So, you know, in the kind of old PowerPoint days, we would often just have like a text box and then, you know, fill every bullet point that we can in that text box. And that's just so overwhelming as an audience member. And so instead being able to just have this one idea. So what's the main point of each slide? And why is that important for your take-home message? Okay. And then the way I think about this too is that thinking about the audience member and what kind of in reality is happening. So I think about that I'm telling a story to a distracted person. And so, you know, you never know, even if you're in person, people still have their phones. They also have their to-do lists in their head. And I can't tell you the number of times I've been listening to a talk and then maybe it's something they said, maybe it's just some random thought that came to my head. I get distracted for a minute and then I come back and now I like missed a slide and I have no idea what's going on. So part of what happens if you focus on this one take-home point and you make sure everything's kind of revolved around that is you end up really being able to connect back to that all the time. So if you miss one slide, you are then going, you know, if as an audience member, you miss a slide, you're able to catch up again. So if I'm presenting results, then I talk about, okay, so I did this study and this is what my hypothesis was. So based on this hypothesis, you know, I collected these data that, you know, these were the data I collected because it will help me answer this hypothesis. And then I tested the hypothesis and got this result. And the reason why this supports or doesn't support this hypothesis, right? I'm going back to kind of that main point. I'm always making sure I'm connecting back to it. And that way, when somebody misses something, it's harder to miss some vital piece and never be able to catch up again. So I like to try to think about making sure my connections to whatever that take-home point is really clear. So, right, so it's like keep your take-home message in mind throughout. And for each slide, say why you're telling the audience that info so that they can understand it. And remind them why you're telling them that. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about kind of, you know, every step of a presentation, but just as a quick thing for introductions, I think about like, why would somebody be interested in what it is that you're going to tell them? So you don't need to go into a lot of detail unless the specifics are needed for your take-home point. So again, what is your take-home point? So what is it that would get somebody interested in this? And what's the minimum amount of detail they need to be able to be convinced that this take-home point is interesting? So, and going back to this idea that I mentioned earlier, that what kind of engages people is you being excited about it, that you think it's interesting. And so when you're thinking about that, kind of infusing just some of who you are into it too, like, how did you get into this? Or not that you want to tell your life story, but there is a story behind, your journey into it that, it's like, oh, I was reading this type of thing, or I learned about this finding, and this finding was interesting, but made me wonder about X, right? So you can kind of take people through that academic journey of why this is interesting. So for me, going back to the self-esteem study that I mentioned earlier, for me, it was, I was asking the question, when do children first have adult-like self-esteem? And so I found that it was, very weird to me to find out that the research said children under 8 can't report on their self-esteem, because it doesn't seem like at 8 you just magically have it, that just suddenly people care about, how they're perceived or whether they're competent or not. And so to me, so I looked for the research, but since there was this main researcher that said that it can't be done, then people weren't even collecting the data. So in my study, I decided I want to figure out whether we can do it or not, because I wasn't happy with just this kind of, anecdotal evidence that it can't be done. I wanted the scientific evidence for it. So that's the kind of way that I can get my journey in there. And that was very brief to just give an example, but that's the type of way that you can approach your introduction of telling that story of your own discovery through the research and your thought processes behind it. Okay, so then presenting results. So here, it's a challenge, right, to not be too technical in what your results are, being able to really communicate your point. So the first part is just, what is your point? What is it that you want what is it that you want to communicate with your results? And as I said earlier, my preference is to use equations and models sparingly or not at all. And I already went through why I think that, so I won't bore you with saying that again. I also try not to use tables. A lot of times people put up like a slide that's just filled with numbers, and then they talk about one number and maybe they'll even circle that number, but now you're circling one of like 30 numbers that are on the screen that are super small and hard to read, all to tell me about one number. So thinking about what is it that you're trying to communicate. If there's something else about those numbers, maybe there's a pattern in there, then you can do things like create, shades of colors, and maybe you don't even need the numbers in there to do that. But thinking about how much information somebody can take in, and so what's reasonable to put on a slide for them to take in, because it really feels frustrating when people put up stuff that you're then just supposed to ignore, because then why is it up there? So thinking about what is really the piece of information you need. And a lot of times a table isn't it, because people just can't take that information in. And so if you really feel like you need a table, figuring out what you're trying to communicate, and is there a different way that's easier to see at the back of a large room, and in the few moments that your slide is going to be up there. So for example, I've done stuff like this. Oh, there's only one number. Here's the number. So I have a picture that kind of represents, this is attachment between parents and kids. I have a parent and a kid. It's not necessary, but it's just trying to get the attention grabber while reinforcing what it is that I'm talking about. And it's got the one number. I don't need all the other numbers that were in that table that I ran in the stats program. So it's an example also of how there's just one point to this slide, which is what this one correlation is. And I find the graphics help me a lot in when I'm trying to figure out what graphic to put on the slide, sometimes I really struggle with, I can't figure out a graphic that matches what I'm saying. And that helps me really force myself to figure out what I'm trying to communicate. Because often I can't find the graphics. I haven't clarified what it is that I'm trying to communicate very well. So I work a lot while I'm writing in graphics, in like Google Images or other programs, trying to find the graphics that match while I'm in the middle of writing. And it feels like this isn't what I'm supposed to do with my time. But for me, it really clarifies my thinking if I have to put it in some kind of graphical term. Other ways that people have done one number is like this, 62%. You've got the dots that are grayed out versus blue to kind of show that 62%. This evergreen data, Stephanie Evergreen has great statistics, ways to present statistics. She has a great data visualization book, lots of blog stuff. I have her information later in the presentation. Another way is like 1 out of 4, right? So just thinking about what are the ways that you can communicate the information that you want. It doesn't have to be, a table or, just a 0.25 or something like that. There's ways to kind of emphasize what it is that you want to communicate. And I most often say don't use pie charts. I rarely find that they seem to work very well with something like this. So when I put something on the screen, I also think of an audience member and what their eyes are doing. So I sit there and stare at my slides as I make them and try to think about where I would look. So for this pie chart, for example, if I'm an audience member, I'm thinking, okay, what is your gender? Okay, so I have to go down here and look and see what all of the gender categories are. Okay, so I figured out now what the gender categories are. Then I go up here and like, okay, so 43% is the most. So it's that blue. So now I have to go back down here and figure out which the blue is. Okay, so that was when, and then I go to the orange and then I go down and I'm like, okay, man. And and so I have to go back and forth up and down in these to go from all of this. And it's then weighing, right? My working memory is getting crowded with all of this. And that's, you want people to just look at it. So I once read someone talk about that a slide should be like a billboard. You can understand it in 30 seconds as you're driving down the freeway. So that I cannot do in this slide. And so again, it's focusing on what do you want someone to learn from this, as opposed to just putting all the information out there. You can always have all the information in extra slides if someone asks the question. But otherwise, you want people to really be able to focus on the piece of information you want them to take away. And one way that helps with that is writing a great title for your figures. So the Pew Research, PEW, they do a lot of research, surveys of people in the US, and I love their figures. I often go through just looking at their figures, like in Google Images, you can say like Pew Research and find figures from them. They write really great titles for it that give away the answer, essentially. So here, this is that pie chart, but instead of having that pie chart and having all these different things I'm looking at, here it's like, you have this title. We have a transgender population we haven't really considered before. And that's in this light blue. I can see this light blue. I can find that piece of information very quickly. I still get this other information, but I don't have to search all over for it, right? We're used to reading left to right. I can just kind of read left to right here, top to bottom for this. But I also know exactly why you're telling me this, because it's in the title. And I can very easily find the statistic that you're referring to in that title. Although maybe a little more contrast in these two blues could have been helpful here. But that's a way to think, right? By creating your figures like this, it makes you stop and think about, why do I want to show this to somebody? And do I need to show it to somebody for them to understand? Is this important? And making sure, don't make them do the work to figure out why you're showing it to them. So again, this is what I was just saying about walking through the slides from the audience perspective. So if we have something like this, it's like, okay, well, birth indicators by year. Well, I don't even know what indicators are, but if I go down here, I can see like, oh, talking about like birth weight, things like that. Not quite. So year, 2015, 16, because when I was up here, I already forgot why there's two numbers. Going through, okay, these two are kind of the same from this one. So what's this one? So walking, it's taking a lot for me to figure that out. I'm doing all of that while a person's talking. I'm not listening to anything that they're saying because I can't multitask that well. And, or something like this, right? Parent versus student perspectives. Well, now I've got to figure out like what all of these are students, parents, percentages, and then all these different categories that, I'm not sure why what I should be looking at in this versus here. It's like, surprisingly, students have lower expectations to go to college than their parents have for them. It's like, will attend college. Oh, okay. So this is lower for students and parents. For me, I'd probably put these labels like maybe up here because I already have to look so far down, but it's highlighting in orange, right? I can see exactly what I'm supposed to look for. And now I know that's what you care about. That's what you're going to tell me more about. A couple other examples. There's, a graph like this versus here, all the information is put up in here so that I can see it much more just reading in the way that I would read across a slide. I can see the answers that matter very quickly. And so these are just, they'll be, I can share the slides so you can go through them on your own, but just quickly, it's like turning this and this into something like this. It looks very different, but it's going to tell me a lot more about what it is that I'm looking for. It's got the answer in the title here. And then this is a different thing where teachers are reluctant to omit when they have fixed mindset thoughts. So it's like the answers in the title. It focuses you down on this yellow, showing this is only 12% of the people, right? So, it's hard in this context for that to be very meaningful to you, but in the middle of a presentation, it's like, this is a way that I can walk somebody through the story better. Okay, and then before I finish out a little bit, I'll just talk about posters a little bit. So all the same kind of rules were for posters too, in terms of really making sure that you have that like one take-home point, that everything is supporting that take-home point, that you don't have extra information that's not needed, and that you've really focused on very clear graphics that tell people what they need to know. So I think of it as like a gigantic infographic. And so this is what poster sessions, if you haven't been to one yet, like it's usually a crowded room where people are walking up and down the aisles and peering through crowds at posters to find ones that they're interested in. And so you want to be eye-catching. You want people to be able to understand it from a distance and quickly. They don't need to be able to understand every point of it, but you want them to be able to see some clear take-home message quickly. And then they can talk to you to get more information about it. You can have handouts with more information or a QR code, right? So it's not like this is all the information they'll ever have, but you want that kind of, getting them engaged with something that's very straightforward to start with. So in my earlier years, this is what my posters look like. And it's what I say don't do. Now I've got these structural models, like why anyone needs to see all this information, and it's just too much. And there's so much text in here, and as if you're walking by and you're just glancing, you're going to glance at that and be like, oh my God, I don't have the energy to do it. At a conference, your brain's just on information overload. That's way too much, right? But instead, this is more how I try to do my posters these days, where it's just, there's only a few points in it. And even this can be overwhelming. And, there's always, I can always see improvements when I go back to my posters. But, it's trying to just be much more clear about, okay, here's the sample, here's the design of it, and here are 3 outcomes from it. If I was to redo this now, I wouldn't say something like impacts for low achieving. I would have, as I said, like writing that great title. I would figure out, like, I was still trying to give too much information here. What is it that I really want people to know? And I would make that be much more prevalent in there. Like, just give people the answer and let them ask for the extra details about it. Okay, and then I'll leave you with resources. So there's this design ideas under, in PowerPoint under design, there's design ideas, and you can put text and a graphic in, and PowerPoint will give you all sorts of options of how to like make it look prettier. So I use that a lot. That's how I made this slide. As I mentioned, Stephanie Evergreen has this great resource. There's potent presentations for the American Evaluation Association. They have checklists of what you should do. They have self-evaluations for your presentations that you can look at. So they've got a lot of great resources. And these are other resources that I use. As I mentioned, like SlideScope. Undraw is completely free. What I love about Undraw is that you can put in the color that you want. You can put in your hex code color. So if you have a slides that you're using, a template you're using that colors in it, it will recolor any graphic to match that for you. And so I think that's a great resource. They don't have as many different graphics, but they do have nice graphics for that. Here are just some Twitter threads that talk about like where to get graphics, where to get free graphics, where to get better representations in your graphics. And that is all of the resources that I have right now for sharing that. So I know we're at time because I did questions in the beginning, but I'm happy to stay and answer any other questions if people have them. Otherwise, I will share this presentation with you so you can look at anything after. I see. What's the point of a poster presentation? So the point of a poster presentation is usually to communicate a finding. And so when people are going to conferences, there's only so many talks people can go to in a conference. So we do these poster presentations so that people can disseminate their research more broadly. And so at posters, it's a way to just find out what's currently happening, what's kind of the quick, it's like a whole bunch of infographics that you can just go and find out what people are doing in your field. Any advice about multiple co-authors collaborating on poster presentations? So I think for that one, I would say outlining what it is that what your goals are and deciding on your main points first is going to be very critical to it. So if you can agree on what the main point is, then you can help each other making sure, like, do we need this to be able to communicate our main point or not? And you can talk about like the best way to do the graphics and to communicate that. But I think it's really making sure that you have that outline and that main goal of your poster of what it is that you want to communicate will help everything moving forward. And then dividing up tasks. If someone needs to take the lead and just start drafting it, and then everybody else can give feedback on it. I do think that there's a question, do you grab their attention with cool, nice graphics? I think so. I think the graphics are definitely attention getters. The colors tend to capture people's attention. I'm much more likely to stop and look if I see that. Is it okay to include a technical explanation? For example, explain the technology behind a product and then after give a simplified explanation? Yes, I often actually give the simplified first and then the technical, because it's easy to decide something's too technical and not pay attention. But if you've already told me what's important about it, then if you already explained it to me, then the technical might help me understand better, or at least I'm not just completely lost when you're doing the technical, because I at least know generally what you're saying. So I like to flip that. But sometimes it's just playing with it each way and figuring out when to do it. But it's also making sure that the technical is needed for people to understand or is going to be interesting. Maybe the goal is to explain the technical. And so you have to do it. Or the point is to do it. So it's just making sure like what's needed and making sure that you're not losing people while you're doing it.
There was another one in here. Is there a memorable presentation you saw that you will never forget? What made it so impactful?
Actually, I don't know if this is gonna be very helpful or not. A memorable one that I saw was one in which whenever I had a question during that presentation, they ended up kind of answering it next. And it really stood out to me because it just felt very well thought out. And I think the way that you do that is by practicing a lot with people when you can to try to figure out what people ask and figuring out and just having that really good logic, like what is the next question someone would ask from this. So if you do this, then what comes next? And that's what stood out. But usually it's something that just tends to flow well and kind of mimics more of a conversation of like, oh yeah, this is what's interesting. Here's what comes next. That tends to be what stands out to me.
Okay, and Alice wanted to know, how can she access your slides?
Sure. I mean, I can send them, to you.
Yes, definitely. I can get them from Dr. Trzesnewski and upload them to Canvas.
Okay, there you go. That's how you go.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely wanted to thank Dr. Trzesnewski for an amazing presentation again and for being our speaker for this series.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for your time. And we'll just end on the comment. Claire said, thank you. This was super helpful. And it was. So thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. I hope you all have fun with your presentations.
Thank you. You could go ahead and stop the recording.